Let's talk about history. Hello, I am Luisa.
Hello, and I am Thomas Cardona.
Today's chapter will talk about the Cultural Revolution of China, its context, how it developed, and of course, its impact on international relations at that time and its current behavior.
About this thing, why we choose it, why the Cultural Revolution of China.
We chose this event because it introduced China to becoming one of the world's greatest powers and also because it is known today as the world's factory.
Yeah, and in addition, for us, it is necessary to highlight the reforms that were made to the country after Mao's death. Since they start working, they opened the door for China to grow out economically. Beneficial changes start, such as the expansion for trade and entry for foreign investment. Knowing that, let's start with the development of the topic. So, in 1912, China ceased to be an empire and adopted the form of a republic. For the following decades were traumatic, for real, for the entire globe. The politician from intention generated a civil war that lasted 23 years between nationalists and communists. Then, in 1949, China was completely devastated after two more decades of war. Then, to the end of hostilities, meant to the mainland was under a command of communists, while the nationalists managed to the main control of Taiwan.
In 1954, the legal and institutional foundation of the People's Republic were laid, with the first conference of the National People's Assembly in which the country's first political constitution was also proclaimed. The organs of the state were elected, President and Vice President of the Republic, the Council of States, the People's Assembly, and the Judiciary. In February of 1956, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was held, in which Nikita Khrushchev launched a fierce criticism against Joseph Stalin. His crime and the cult of his personality influenced almost all the communist parties in the world, including the Chinese. In part, this explains why the new government regulations omitted the mention of Mao Zedong's throws as the party's doctrinal basis, along with Marxism-Leninism as had happened in the 7th Congress of 1942 in the Young Guerrilla base. Yeah, but it is important to say that in any case, at the 8th Congress, a wide recognition was made of Mao's role in leading the Communist Party. Mao was at the head of the Communist Party of China, with the rank of chairperson. He was followed in descending hierarchical order by first Vice President Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, among others.
By the way, Mao had also been elected in 1954 by the APN, also known as the National People's Congress of China, as a head of the state. But, in contrast, in 1958, he simply declared that he would not be longer the president and the second in the party's hierarchy of the state. Sharing with this part, Liu Shaoqi temporarily assumed the function of Mao. In the year of 1959, on April 27, Liu was formally elected president of the People's Republic of China in that time.
So, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution began between 1966 to 1976. The Cultural Revolution took place in the following stages. Mass mobilization, 1966. In its initial stage, the Cultural Revolution massively mobilized the students of the country and later workers, military and civilian servants to form Red Guards to pursue and defeat the supposed bourgeois enemies who, infiltrated in the country, prevented the revolution from advancing towards its destiny. These ultra-fanatical groups traveled around the country financed by the state, recruiting members for the cause and organizing mass rallies, in which the abandonment of the old Chinese customs was encouraged and the figure of Mao Zedong was exalted. At the height of the mobilization, traditional Chinese temples were destroyed, libraries looted, and books burned, while the youth marched with Mao's Red Book under their arms.
Then we have the Red Terror, an era towards the end of the 1966. The country was in chaos. The assaults by Red Guards had ceased to be guarded by the police and the destruction of the party. Those who disobeyed it were accused as counter-revolutionaries, but also between August and September, some 1,727 people were killed. And because of that, Mao called a central level conference where he succeeded in foreign self-criticisms, thus eliminating their opposition in the party altogether because of the thinking of the opponent. Then we have an era known as Mao's return to power, the 1967 to 1969. With no possible opponent, Mao called in the army to restore order to the nation during the first months of 1967. However, the Red Guards acted freely for another year. In April 1969, the Ninth Congress of the Communist Party of China was convened, where Mao's authority as party leader and military leader was reaffirmed. His doctrine was adopted as the central ideology of the party and the nation. At the same time, Lin Biao was appointed as his second-in-command as successor. The Cultural Revolution was officially over.
Mao died in 1976 and was succeeded by Hua Guofen, who surprisingly had the Gang of Four imprisoned, blaming them for all the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, and rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping, who ended up ruling the country and promotes economic growth and the reformism that Mao feared so much.
There are some economic consequences during this process of revolution. For example, the transportation and construction suffered, with revenue declines of 25.8% and 24% respectively in the fast revolution triennium. Also, commerce only lost 3% of this turnover, while agriculture achieved a slight increase of 3.2% in this collection between 1966 and 1968.
As of 1969, the country's situation began to stabilize. The Cultural Revolution brought an almost civil war scenario, with a military presence between 1968 and 1971 to the fields of crops and production plants. Towards 1971, before the weakening of the authorities, the Red Guards and the army, they suggested small black markets in which basic products were exchanged clandestinely.
Another thing that we need to be focused on is the impact of international business. For example, what happened during the revolution and with the international relationships of China during that process.
Throughout 1967 and 1968, acts of rebellion and irrationality occurred in the fields of international relations, perhaps not as tragic as in the Chinese territory, but with serious repercussions for the position of the PRC in the world and its own security. It should be noted that the diplomatic relations of People's China were limited to the countries of the Socialist bloc in Europe, some in Western Europe, Africa and Asia, none in America, except Cuba since 1961. From the second half of 1966, the Beijing government began to call its ambassadors abroad until only the accredited one in Egypt remained. The few students and technicians who lived abroad were also repatriated, and many of them carried the slogan of agitating and provoking revolutionary excesses in the countries from which they returned to China.
Moreover, Chinese embassies, notably in the USSR and the United Kingdom, to name two cases of strange political systems, also caused discharges in Moscow and London. Then, in the rest of Southeast Asia, the People's Republic only had diplomatic relations with Indonesia. By the way, in October 1965, a serious crisis broke out there when a group of journalists led by Suharto launched an attack of the Indonesian Communist Party, hesitating, taking and destruction of the embassies of the People's Republic, to the persecution of Indonesia of Chinese origin, and throughout the country to the true genocide that was carried out the following years. Then, some Chinese diplomats who had suffered the attack on their embassy in Jakarta were greeted in the country as heroes.
Other excesses were committed against the diplomatic mission of the Soviet Union and its personnel, as well as against diplomats and facilities of Burma, now Myanmar, and other socialist countries of Eastern Europe. After the revolution, China, despite being an international power in political and military terms, was and is one of the 5 members of the UN Security Council and had nuclear weapons, but nevertheless a poor and backward country. For Mao, the priority has been politics in a key question facing China, especially at the time of the Cultural Revolution, was the class struggle.
Another thing is that this revolution paralyzed the economy of China, plagued by poverty and hunger. Mao Zedong's calls for a mass mobilization and a class struggle provocating chaos from which this country emerged. Also opening up to the market economy and entering a boom that has turned it into a world power. An interesting fact is that the most important legacy of the Cultural Revolution was the emergence of black markets that prevent citizens from starving and forced communist leaders to abandon the planned economy.
The Cultural Revolution occurred, moreover, at a time when, after the breakdown of relations between Beijing and Moscow, China was financially and commercially isolated within the Cold War communist bloc and had not yet opened up to the rest of the world. When Deng Xiaoping took power in 1979 after Mao's death, he saw that he will not be able to maintain a planned economy for long and that he was forced to make some challenge, called reform and opening up, which managed to lift 740 million people out of poverty, according to the official figures. When Deng Xiaoping took power in 1979 after Mao's death, he saw that he will not be able to maintain a planned economy for long and that he was forced to make some challenge, called reform and opening up, which managed to lift 740 million people out of poverty, according to the official figures. Under the idea of a socialism with the Chinese characteristic, Deng broke the status quo and promotes a series of economic reforms focused on the agriculture, liberalization of the private sector, modernization of industry, and the opening of China to foreign trade.
In addition, in the agricultural sector, for example, the Maoist system of the plain and rural economy was progressively abandoned, increasing productivity and 15 parts of the country out of poverty, encouraging labor migration to the cities. And also the change of the private sector were also lucid. And for the first time since the creation of the People's Republic in 1949, the country was open to foreign investments. Another interesting thing is that special economic zones were created, such as the city of Shenzhen, which underwent an incredible transformation, and today it is often described as the Chinese Silicon Valley.
Its challenge led China after a long process to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, which definitely opened the doors to globalization, which helped it so much in its economic boom. In 2008, when the global financial crisis broke out and the West began to search for new markets, China stood out among them all, becoming the factory of the world. Then came the case of dizzying economic growth that turned China, the world's most populous country and the third largest in terms of territory, into the world's second largest economy. This is the end of today's podcast. Don't forget to follow us on our social networks.